Hey guys, welcome back. This is your instructor, Jason McCoy. Good to be with you. Today I thought I would bring you a little virtual lecture on social behavior, also known as social psychology, chapter 14 in your text. Slides 46 to 73 in this slideshow. Coming to you from my humble garage office at my place of residence. I'm sorry I was not able to cover all of this information in class before you were asked to complete your first exam. And speaking of that first exam, remember it's due no later than 11:59 p.m. February 4th. So make sure you take care of that if you haven't already done so. And I believe this lecture is going to help you tremendously in preparation for that exam. Is there anything worse than smoking cigarettes? I mean, is there anything worse for your health, psychologically or physically, than smoking cigarettes? And no, it's not group work, but I know exactly what you mean if that's what you were thinking. I mean, after all, group work always goes wrong, doesn't it? I mean, there's one person, probably yourself, that does 99% of the work, or okay, at least 98%. There's another person that never has any idea what's going on the entire time you're doing the project. Another person that says they're going to help but totally never does. In fact, that person can't even be reached by email or by text. And then there's that person that shows up on the first meeting with all these great ideas and all of this energy and motivation, but then never comes back until the very end. You know, that last meeting you have when you're making sure you've spelled everybody's name correctly for the title page. In all honesty, there is something that may be worse than smoking cigarettes for your health, that is. And that's despite what Napoleon Bonaparte said. A recent meta-analysis by Leet Kranick found that when examining 70 scientific publications that altogether included more than 3 million participants, loneliness, social isolation, living alone were factors in explaining early death. Other studies and other scientists have found that literally being alone throughout life shaves off as many years as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. Let's take a look at another study. Tim Wilson and his colleagues at the University of Virginia, just right up the road here in Charlottesville, Virginia, asked students to trade their time about 6 to 15 minutes for some extra credit and some gift cards. Students voluntarily went into a room one by one and were told to just sit quietly for anywhere between 6 and 15 minutes. And the researchers told them that the only thing they could do is sit quietly or at their own risk tinker with a little game that the researchers had placed on the table in front of them. This game, the researchers were told, would actually cause an electrical shock. They didn't specify how powerful the electric shock was, but they said it's a mild electrical shock. 67%, would you believe, of men and 25% of women in that study administered to themselves voluntarily electrical shocks with that machine rather than just sit there quietly and think. Can you believe that? What kind of sadist? How bored would you have to be to purposefully shock yourself? Well, I don't know how bored you'd have to be to purposely shock yourself, but thanks to a Yale psychologist back in the 1960s, I know how bored you'd have to be in order to shock others. And the answer to that question is not at all. You see, back in the 1960s, a Yale professor of psychology named Stanley Milgram was interested in trying to explain why high-ranking officials as well as common people throughout Germany went along with Adolf Hitler's final solution. That final solution, or that Third Reich, being to annihilate all of the Jewish people on the earth. Now, when Milgram, some of you may have read about this in your chapter. Here's the classic setup by Stanley Milgram. Milgram, or an experimenter, would sit at one table in a laboratory at Yale. A volunteer who was in on the study, what we call a confederate, would be the student.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud, horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Refuses to go on. The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man, eh? I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one, slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure.
What did we find? We found that quite a few people, right, about 75% of the people in the original study were willing to deliver electric shocks, or at least what they thought were electric shocks, to a completely innocent person. Now, variations in this study have occurred since the 1960s. When, for instance, teachers are asked to deliver their own shock levels, the chance of that teacher going all the way to the end of the shock board of 450 volts was only 3%. Again, notice, in the original setup down at the bottom bar graph, 65% of the participants went all the way to 450 volts. If, for instance, a teacher sees two other teachers rebel, then that teacher is only 10% likely to complete the study. So what we found since Milgram's original study is that people are, in fact, looking to others for instructions as to what to do in situations where they're maybe uncertain. But by tweaking the environment, tweaking the participants, tweaking the distance between participant and confederate, by tweaking the room itself that the experiment is being conducted in, and many of the others you see here on the screen, you can, in fact, reduce the likelihood that participants will adhere to authority. Again, here's another graphic of a variety of conditions under which participants were more or less likely to follow the orders or follow the recommendations of the authority figure. Social psychology is full of these kinds of creative experiments, full of these kinds of, seemingly unethical experiments. By today's standards, you probably wouldn't get a protocol, let alone this study past an IRB, an internal review board, an ethics board. But again, social psychologists, both then and now, never mind the ethics of the studies then, have something in common. Again, social psychologists study how other people, whether those people are real or whether those people are just being imagined by someone, will affect how that someone thinks, feels, and behaves. Think about your own life. If you believe that someone can hear you, if you believe that you're being, observed, do you act differently? Social psychologists focus on the context or the situation. They believe that the situation matters more than maybe anything else. Philip Zimbardo, the famous psychologist from Stanford University, known for his infamous Stanford prison study you may have read about in chapter 14, said There's no such thing as a bad apple, making reference to the prison guards in his original study in the 1970s. He said it's the situation these guards find themselves in. The whole environment is spoiled, right? The barrel is made up of vinegar. And if there's an apple in that barrel, it's going to get spoiled, no matter which apple it is. Finally, social psychologists believe that interrelationships are of most importance. Just a handful of very important social psychologists that you need to read about and think about include Solomon Asch, Stanley Milgram's mentor, Leon Festinger, the man whose cognitive dissonance research you'll read about and hear me talk about in this presentation, and finally, Bibb Latané and John Darley, two researchers back in the 1960s who did some incredible work demonstrating how difficult it is for people to help other people in emergency situations. Again, more on that in a bit. These are a couple of other important studies that you may or may not have already heard or read about. Again, the scientific subdiscipline of social psychology focuses on the extent to which real or imagined presence of others will affect behavior, thoughts, and feelings. So all of these studies, and the ones you're looking at on the screen, are some of the most historic and pioneering and classic studies in social psychology, but also all of the studies that are being done today in 2020 and beyond have this sort of definition in common. So whether you're talking about Norman Triplett's study of social facilitation, or you're talking about Solomon Asch's line study, Milgram's shock study, Festinger's cognitive dissonance, Darley and Latané's bystander study, or again, Philip Zimbardo's prison study at Stanford in the 1970s, the thing they have in common, and have in common with not only themselves, but again, with studies being done today, studies that are referenced throughout Chapter 14, is that they're looking at the context, the situation, the interrelationships, the extent to which real or imagined others will affect the behavior or thoughts or feelings of the person doing the imagining or being, in fact, influenced by the presence of others. This is us. That is them. Tribalism 2.0. Is there anything more polarizing today than political affiliation? Not only that, but I guess a better question would be, is there anything because of political affiliation that is not polarized? I mean, quite literally, it seems that every time you read an article, hear a politician talk, see a news broadcaster, hear a conversation among friends, nothing, and I mean nothing, seems to be agreed upon. I mean, we can't even agree to wear masks to protect one another from a global pandemic. Heck, we can't even agree to the extent that there is a global pandemic. It seems as if today we are very much like our ancestors, tribal to the core. There's us and there's them. And think about the danger of believing that there is two categories and only two categories of belonging. You versus them. Let's take a look at this video to give you a little more insight into how tribalism continues to dominate the brains of us social creatures to this day.
It's this double nature, I believe, that predisposes us to the most deeply rooted of all human behaviors: tribalism.
My name is Wolf Shipman. I go to Davidson High School. I play the bassoon, and I am the drum major in marching band. The marching band family, there's a kind of unity to it. Once you come into the band room, after the first couple weeks of being called freshman and being made fun of, you become part of this family where you're the little brother and everyone wants to take care of you. We become something of a unit, even in the school. Everyone knows who the band nerds are. We all kind of hang together. It becomes a family setting, really. It just feels like a place the band kids can call home.
A home, a secure nest, a group. We humans create tribes and cultures to give ourselves a feeling of belonging and security. They give us joy and the language to express our innermost feelings. Exclusion makes us suffer. Inclusion makes us thrive.
My name is Craig Worley. I'm a 1990 graduate of the University of Alabama and a lifelong Crimson Tide supporter. I would say in Alabama, football is treated with the same reverence that religion is. The traditions are honored. The pageantry is honored, from generation to generation.
My name is Penny Jo Lambert, and I've been an Alabama fan my entire life. Being an Alabama fan means pride, passion, respect, tradition.
These collective sentiments, the emotions that we feel only when we are doing something with the group and as a group. I think modern people can best identify this if they've been to a World Cup game or any sort of major sporting event. There's a kind of collective ecstasy that happens when the group is competing with another group, and people love it. That's why we have sports in the first place. Sports make no sense unless you see that we are group-selected creatures who love being a group competing with another group. I mean, why waste the time and money otherwise?
It's a way of life. It's a tradition that's been passed down from generation to generation. And for so many during football season, that Saturday, they wake up, they cook out, they spend the time with their family and their friends, and it becomes a way of life.
Nothing displays our desire for group belonging and identification better than sports. At my alma mater, the University of Alabama, football is virtually a religion. The adulation for our team, the Crimson Tide, is something to behold. Okay, you ready?
Yes, sir.
All right.
My name is Brandon Gibson. I came to the University of Alabama to play football for the Crimson Tide in 2007. I had the opportunity to play on 2 national championship teams.
This was the Alabama that I lived in. The mansion was there. The law school was there.
That was still there.
Oh, that's been there since the 1800s, yeah. And
really?
Can you imagine in your mind being here as a student in the 1940s? I'm beginning to have difficulty thinking of it myself.
I wonder what. It's awesome to be a part of a team, because you're working towards the same thing. Every time we would go out for practice, there's a quote with a picture on the wall that says, "Out of yourself and into the team."
I like that. Well, I, too, have been a lifelong fan of the Crimson Tide. I know at firsthand the passion sports can arouse. You know, I'm going to ask you a request, and you can turn me down if you want to, but I sure would like to look at that championship ring you're wearing.
Hey.
Oh, yeah, let me...
You know, I'll pass it to a lot of people, but it'd be an honor to pass it to you. So
I am.
You have at it now.
Okay. I get to hold it.
You get to hold it right
But
now.
I'm not going to put it on, but at least I'll get to hold it. The mother of all sporting events here in Alabama is the Iron Bowl, the game with our old college rivals, Auburn. It's the wildest spectacle I know of humanity's primordial group instinct. Auburn University is just 80 miles away, and its students are, to all intents and purposes, exactly the same as those of the University of Alabama. So this rivalry has no basis except pure tribal instinct.
One of those things where you get so many people pulling in the same direction. It just creates a momentum that is just hard to explain. But you feel it when you're in a crowd where everybody is pulling in the same direction.
As they approach the stadium, the players are like gladiators preparing for combat. It's not too much to call the game that's coming up this afternoon a ritualization of war. People love it. They love the ritualized version. It brings out an instinct that is deep and powerful as any that directs the human psyche. There's a reason why the spectacle of teams on a field of battle excites such powerful emotions in us. In Darwinian terms, they've acquired territory and prestige and rank and power relevant to all the other competing teams. Along the sides of the field of battle, there are young, nubile women dancing and shouting to the young men to encourage them to stronger and more violent action to carry the victory home.
When you're in the stadium, it's like having 100,000 of your closest friends and family nearby. Alabama fans say Roll Tide and use it as a greeting, a salutation, and also a war cry.
This is the profound identity we can feel with a group as it competes with another group. It's a sort of communion that transcends our individual selves. There is an ecstasy that is almost religious. In fact, I believe that religion has its roots right here in this sense of profound communion we can feel in these situations of collective euphoria, being lifted out of ourselves. that sense of collective belief, of bonding in the service of a greater cause.
From Ed's writings, I don't get the impression that he believes in God or is a religious man, but yet he can't stop writing about religion. He's fascinated by it, and I suspect he's interested in it for the same reason that I am, which is that if you're trying to understand this extraordinary groupishness of human beings, you've got to see religion as something that we evolved to facilitate that. In other words, religion is one of our biological and cultural adaptations for crossing that divide from being solitary individuals to becoming a superorganism.
Religion is the highest expression of our tribal longings to be part of a greater whole. A celebration of the collective communion that group selection has predisposed us to. But tribalism is a double-edged sword. The collective communion it promises isn't open to us all. The flip side of tribal belonging is brutal exclusion. No human institution easily escapes the darker angels of our divided self.
How easy is it for us to form these identities based upon little to nothing? What is the remedy for all of this social isolation? What is the remedy for all of this pain caused by tribalism? We live in groups. We are influenced by social settings. We evolved to live social lives. People work very hard to preserve their social lives. People do almost anything, take almost any risk to remain part of the group, to hang on to group organization and cohesion. Consider some of the concepts that you see on the screen, like groupthink, polarization, self-serving bias, and cognitive dissonance. Consider how we modify our behaviors in the presence of others, whether real or imagined. Consider Norman Triplett's home field advantage.
It's a fact. Winning makes you feel good. In the wild, males compete with each other to win their females. Some develop weapons to gain advantage over others, like how the male peacock struts and flaunts their feathers for the ladies. Of course, the most striking strut wins, but what about human beings? Does the presence of others trigger our competitive nature? Do we display our charms when faced with competition? In 1898, scientist Norman Triplett asked the question, what happens when individuals come together? Triplett, himself a cycling enthusiast, noticed that cyclists perform better in races with other people than they did when they were alone. Do people perform better when in groups rather than alone? To test his theory, Triplett conducted a lab test with 40 children playing a simple game in pairs and alone. Kids were asked to wind the reel on a small fishing reel as quickly as possible 150 times, and they were timed accordingly. Triplett wanted to test whether or not performance would be enhanced in the presence of other people performing the same tasks. He found that those who played the game in pairs turned the reel 1% faster than those who were alone. The findings suggest that performance of a task is enhanced by the presence of another person performing the same task. This landmark experiment led to the birth of the social facilitation effect. So, how can you make use of your own competitive instinct to your advantage? The next time you're trying to run further on your morning jog or clock in a higher score on that video game, get your friends to come over and trigger your animal instinct and win.
Social psychology. It's the science of social behavior. But why isn't it always rational and straightforward? Why would someone tolerate their racist relatives? Why do we invest the most and sacrifice the most for people that are most related to us? Why is it that in-group and out-group bias isn't always so simple? Why do we tend to love our pets even more than we love some humans? I want you to think about this. My own research a few years ago with Dr. Richard Topolsky and his students, Nicole Weaver and Zachary Martin, found that when given a choice, a large percentage, about 47% of students, would save an animal's life over that of another human. Now, to be fair, not just any other human. You notice from the graph from Psychology Today that people, both men and women, were more likely, or at least they said that they would be more likely to save, in an emergency situation, an animal over a foreign tourist or a hometown stranger, maybe even a distant cousin. Only a couple of people were willing to save that animal over a best friend, grandparent, sibling. And this raised an important question. In fact, people that were peer reviewing or criticizing our research said this is a wild, speculative hypothetical, that what people say they would do versus what people would actually do are very different, very distant. Around the same time this study was published by a journal called AnthroZoo, a couple sailing off the coast of South Africa capsized. A man, his wife, and a dog were literally floating in the ocean. The man grabbed the dog and swam to shore with him. Went back, of course, and found his wife still alive, floating in the water, and helped her to shore. He received lots of criticism for doing this. And journalists across the world began to look the internet to see if there was any explanation for why someone would forego saving the life of a loved one, of a human, for an animal. And since my study was one of the first published around this time, the media found my study. They wanted to know, is it possible that someone would really save an animal over a human life? And I said, yes, according to my research, absolutely. And then, of course, the next question was, well, is this a rarity? I mean, would there something need to be wrong with a person's brain in order to do this? And my answer was, no, I don't think so. My own study showed that 40-some-odd% of people said they were willing to save a pet's life over that of a foreign tourist or a hometown stranger. And then, of course, the final question the media asked me was, why do you think that is the case? Like, what's going on in the brain of an average person to make him or her more likely to save an animal over a human? And doesn't that fly in the face of kin selection or inclusive fitness? This idea that we're supposed to invest in what is biologically closest to us? And I said, yes and no. I think the brain is an extraordinary organ that evolved over millennia. It evolved a flexibility. And those things that we believe, that we feel are most related to us are going to activate the compassion circuits in our brain. They're going to activate the pathways in the brain that tell us how to treat others with kindness, love, and maybe even how to sacrifice for them. I believe that we quite literally, through a sort of self-deception, be tricking ourselves into believing that these animals are closer, that they're relatives to us. I believe that the more you do with your animal or for your animal to convince your brain that that animal is a close relative, the more likely you are to feel invested in and therefore willing to make a sacrifice, including make a sacrifice of life. Now, there is a dark side to tribalism. We saw it with the insurrection at the Capitol about 3 weeks ago. You also see it with stereotypes, with racism. Now, a stereotype does not necessarily lead to racism, but a stereotype does seem to underlie all sorts of isms. It's a schema. It's a framework for how people are likely to behave based on the group to which they belong. Stereotypes are mental shortcuts. They're heuristics. They're ways of thinking about the world that help us fit things neatly into categories, even if we don't have enough information to actually put things or people into a certain category. We look at some of the more salient features and lump them together nonetheless. This is why it's so surprising when an athlete like Colin Kaepernick seems to throw his entire career away just because he takes a knee. I mean, who among us would throw all of their hopes and dreams away just to make a political point? The gentleman on the other side of the screen says, I am from Bihar. The minute he says Bihar, the minute you look at his face, the minute you look at the background, the stereotype begins to bubble up. This is clearly someone from a third world country, right? A developing world country. This is clearly someone who is not American, who could not speak English. And if he did, it couldn't be that good. But he says, hi, I'm from Bihar, and my English is impeccable. The only reason these two examples are difficult for us to wrap our heads around is because they bust our stereotypes about what it means to be American and what it means to sacrifice things. So there's stereotypes, there's prejudice, there's racism, there's discrimination. And again, stereotypes do not necessarily lead to racism and prejudice and discrimination, but they do tend to be there underneath the surface. Again, another way of looking at a stereotype is that it is an unfair generalization of all people who belong to one group. And this may be intuitively handy, quick and easy mental shortcut, or heuristic, as I said, based upon superficial assessments of a person's membership into certain groups. The problem is that stereotypes are not necessarily accurate. Also, people are more complex and nuanced than a stereotype demands or predicts. Now, prejudice, which again isn't always connected to stereotyping, but obviously can be, is a preconceived judgment or opinion about someone. It often stems from stereotyping instead of careful observation. Again, it's a handy shortcut. It's an adverse opinion or leaning towards someone or something without sufficient grounds or evidence. And what are some ways that you might jump to these conclusions? Why would you not have sufficient grounds or evidence to support your prejudices? Because you're intellectually lazy? Because you don't have enough time to get to know the person? This operates both explicitly as well as implicitly. We are not always conscious of our prejudices. Racism is the belief that a race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and furthermore, the belief that racial differences have inherent value in determining superiority and inferiority. For example, what's best and what is worst. Not always overt, as is the case with implicit bias.
You're not biased, right? This free online test might tell you otherwise. The Implicit Association Test, or IAT, can reveal racial and gender biases you might not even know you have. Here's how it works. The test asks you to rapidly group a series of images and words. For instance, in one section of the Race IAT, you press a certain key whenever you see a white face or a positive word. You press another key if it's a black face or a negative word. And you have to react as fast as you can. In another section, the associations are reversed. White faces go with negative words, while black faces are grouped with positive words. It turns out that 70% of test takers, white and non-white, respond more slowly when grouping black faces with positive words. The test calls this an automatic preference for white people. Other IAT tests on subjects like gender and disability have also found pervasive automatic associations that mirror social stereotypes. Your IAT results may well surprise you. Indeed, most test takers would answer on a questionnaire that white and black people are equal, and men and women should have equal pay. And many of them honestly think so. We're not talking about extremists here, but people like you and me. So what might the IAT reveal about us?
We may grow in our life to recognize that we don't endorse a particular stereotype about a group, but that doesn't mean that we lose that memory for what the culture has taught us the stereotype to be. This is a spoiler alert, but you may know that Santa Claus is not real, but that doesn't prevent you from having a full narrative about who that person is and looks like and what he does. And stereotypes are often the same way. By function of simply seeing someone from the group, one of the things we do unconsciously and automatically is pull out of memory all the information we have about the group.
And these memories shape what we perceive as reality without us realizing it. Once we identify situations prone to producing bias, we can take steps to blind decision makers to the identity of those affected by their decisions. One thing is clear: merely wanting to change is not enough.
Racism is not always explicit. Racism can be benign. Racism can be implicit. Take a look at the graph to your right. Researchers Bertrand and Mullinathon, 2004, I believe these guys are at Princeton University, but I could be wrong, looked at whether or not there was bias in offering people jobs after reviewing their resumes. Job applicants with African-American sounding names got fewer callbacks when they applied for the same job. Now, this is surprising given the fact that the only thing that differed about the two applications was the name, not the experience, not the education, not the awards, not the resume quality. The callback rate was significantly lower for resumes that had African-American names attached. Finally, discrimination. When you think discrimination, you think about treatment. You think about behavior. You don't think about just judgment. You don't think about just prejudice. You think about preferentially treating certain people a certain way based upon your prejudgments, right? So this is sort of the culmination, maybe the logical conclusion of prejudicial thinking. Selecting someone for your team because of their skin color or because of their height. Knowing little to nothing about their actual abilities. Can you erase racism? There are some studies to suggest that you can. I think if you go back and think about the example of the Iron Bowl, where you're at one university with a friend from high school who plays for the football team, and another friend from that same high school now plays for the rival team, and you have love for one of those players but not the other, particularly on game day. You see this all the time in bars and in get-togethers. If the biggest racist on the earth is watching a football game, and the target of that person's racism based on skin color walks out onto the field, but is wearing the jersey of your favorite team or of the racist favorite team, then that racist is probably not going to have a problem. In fact, I've seen people who might otherwise be described as racist towards, say, African Americans, scream and cheer and get excited when the African American linebacker wearing the jersey of their favorite team crushes the white quarterback of the other team. The biggest racists in the world will cheer this coming Sunday if a Kansas City Chief, no matter his skin color, sacks and maybe ultimately knocks the white guy, Tom Brady, out of the game, provided that the person watching the game is a Chiefs fan and, of course, not a Tampa Bay Buccaneer or Tom Brady fan. How can racism be measured? You can ask people through direct surveys. Of course, this is only as good as people are willing to admit their racism. Again, this might work for explicit racism, but even if you don't think you're racist, there's some evidence to suggest that systematic or systemic racism at the implicit level still exists. You can test people indirectly with general statistics. Just look at things like how African Americans are disciplined for the same crime. Look at how likely they are to be killed by police officers. compared to that of their white counterparts. Look at distributions of wealth throughout history. Look at home ownership between whites and blacks. Look at, again, these job application / resume studies. Look at the implicit association test that I asked you to Google. And yes, even first-person shooter training tests. Turns out that you're much more likely to shoot an unarmed black person in a first-person shooter test, a training exercise, than you are an unarmed white person, suggesting that your brain takes a little more time and a little more caution before it associates danger with white skin color as it does with danger in black skin color. There's even studies to suggest that an African American is estimated to be several years older than a white American the same age. 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio, I believe it was playing in a park outside his mother's place of employment with a toy gun. The police were called. Dispatch contacted officers close to the park and said there were reports of an African American man, not boy, not child, an African American man, approximately 18 years old, brandishing a weapon, that he is armed. Video footage of the incident shows that the police officers rolled into the park, and before their car ever stopped, doors were already opened and shots were being fired into the body of young 12-year-old Tamir Rice. Again, most of us are not even conscious of our isms. Racism, sexism, ageism. And these implicit association tests that you can look for and participate in Google and read about in chapter 14 of the Feist book will show you just how implicitly biased you are as well. What's with the attitude? Attitudes refer to your beliefs, your feelings, or your actions towards other people. If a person's attitude is instinctive or biological, then it stands to reason that it may be intractable and we may not be able to change it. If, however, attitudes are learned, then perhaps we can change them. Perhaps they're more flexible. There's actually evidence for both an evolutionary explanation as well as a learned explanation. The evolutionary explanation comes from what's called the Westermarck hypothesis. It turns out that we have real disgust about getting close intimately or sexually with our relatives. This might be an evolutionary-based mechanism to keep us from having offspring with genetic sequences that are too narrow, too much like our own. In other words, disgust, as explained by the Westermarck hypothesis, might be a solution to the problem of inbreeding. Now, there's also evidence that attitudes are learned. Just consider what's called the mere exposure effect. This is a phenomenon that social psychologists have studied for many, many decades. It turns out that we tend to like things and people more. We find them more attractive, more interesting, the more we're exposed to them. So if I bring a photograph of a total stranger and put it on the wall in the classroom, and I ask you on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 is the least attractive person you've ever seen in your life, and 100 is the most attractive person you've ever seen in your life, or 0 is the most unfriendly person you've ever seen in your life, and 100 is the most friendly person you've ever seen in your life. Rate that person. Over the course of the semester, I ask you to do the same thing. Rate that person's image each and every day. What will happen is that your attitudes your ratings towards that person's physical attractiveness and that person's amicability, that person's friendliness, should increase over the semester, despite the fact that that's impossible. Your attitude changes, even though the only information you're ever receiving about that person is what merely you're being exposed to each and every day. You're not learning anything new about them, but just merely by being exposed to their photograph, you begin to change your mind. So this idea of attitude adjustment or changing one's mind does have a basis in reality. There is precedent for this. And it's a good thing too. It's a good thing that there's precedent for changing our minds. There's precedent for changing how we feel, how we think, and maybe even how we behave. You know, society imposes rules about what constitutes acceptable behavior. So it's a good thing that we have norms. It's an even better thing that we're capable of following these norms. Even if we're not biologically ready to follow them, we have learning mechanisms that allow us, it seems, to follow them. Boys don't. Girls should. Burping at the dinner table is considered. These are all examples of norms. But the truth is, despite the fact that we've heard norms, that we've even followed some of these norms, we can question them. And under the right circumstances, we can even challenge them or change the way we view them or change the way we behave about them. Most of the time, we stay in line or we stay close to the line. This is known as conformity. This is known as social influence. There are two types of conformity. There are two types of staying within the lines. One is called informational social influence. This is when we look to other people to tell us how to behave, to tell us where the line is. And we look to those people because we believe they have special knowledge. In other words, if you're at a fancy dinner party, you might look around the table to see which glass everyone else grabs, to see which fork everyone else grabs, to see which knife everyone else uses before you pick up one for yourself. You're not sure whether to pick up the fork to your left or right. So you look to others that you believe, that you trust, have more knowledge, that look like they have more knowledge. You look to them for guidance, for informational social influence. Now, there are other types of social influences, normative social influences. In a normative social influence, we look to others because we want to be accepted by them. We look to others because we want to be like them. We look to others because we want other people to think we're like them. The reason I wear a pair of shoes could be because I trust that a person with knowledge about shoes knows better than I do, and therefore I'm going to take their advice. That's an informational social influence. However, if I wear the pair of shoes because one of my favorite athletes or my favorite actors, someone famous is wearing them, then that's a normative social influence. There is a series of classic studies on conformity, beginning in the 1950s with a Professor Solomon Asch, who was the mentor to a gentleman we've already talked about named Stanley Milgram. Watch here as we see a reincarnation of Asch's original research.
We're on the deck of the USS Intrepid conducting an experiment, and the rules of the game couldn't be simpler.
You've got to decide which one of these three straight lines is the same length as this first card.
Take a look for yourself. Think you've got it? Before we reveal the answer, we'll show you where these people stand.
I think it's A.
A.
A. It's A.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with A.
It looks like everyone is going with A.
Definitely A.
Do they know something you don't?
What do you think?
Take one last look. Are you going with these people who all picked A? Or did you choose to go with B or C? Time's up. Got your pick?
It's A.
You're gonna go with the group?
Yeah.
All right, great.
Is that what you picked? Or did you go with another answer? It turns out the answer to this round is C. And while you likely chose C first and stuck with your answer, we also know that some viewers might have felt the peer pressure and switched to A.
It's A.
I want to ask you something. Did your gut at first tell you that the answer was actually C?
Yeah, but everyone was choosing A, so I just felt like I had to pick A too.
You felt the pull of the crowd.
Yeah.
In case you haven't figured it out yet, we'll let you in on a little secret. The first 9 people in this line were working for us, and each time we ran the experiment, they were instructed to pick the same wrong answer.
A.
A.
A. It's A.
Seeing all these people choose A left the last person in line who wasn't in on it with a tough decision: to go with their gut or with a group.
You're gonna go with the group?
Yeah.
Although not all of the test subjects at the end of the line fell for it.
I think it's C.
In spite of what everybody else thinks. You don't trust the wisdom of the crowd?
I'm trusting my gut.
Okay.
To be perfectly honest, I think C looks closest.
And you think that they're all wrong?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, guys.
And don't beat yourself up if you were tempted to go along with the crowd.
Make your choice.
I'm gonna have to go with A.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. What happened?
I have a confession.
Okay.
I actually thought it was C.
Did you start to question your own judgment?
I did. I don't want to be the dumb kid. I don't want to stand out. You know, I was like, A.
Have you ever ignored the truth to fit in with a group? Just think, what if those weren't lines, but evidence in a murder case? Would you be able to see past the group consensus and just go with your gut?
Studies show that when someone holds a different opinion than the rest of the group, the anterior cingulate cortex, also known as the oops area of the brain, produces an error signal. We try to fix that by modifying our opinion to be in line with the group, even if it's a viewpoint we're uncomfortable with or know is wrong. And that's because there are some major evolutionary advantages for those who follow along with the group.
Interesting. This was from a series called Brain Games. And what you noticed is that as long as people who are in on the experiment give the wrong answer pretty confidently, the person actually being tested, the one who doesn't realize that this is an experiment and that other people are in on it, will actually give the wrong answer as well. This is exactly what Solomon Asch found in his original research, looking at comparing and contrasting line segments in the 1950s. This is the perfect example of conformity. What can you do if you want to change your mind? I mean, can your attitudes be changed? Can you change the minds of others? There are 2 major reasons, or 2 major ways that we can think about making attitude adjustments or attitude changes. Social psychologists look at cognitive dissonance and they look at persuasion. Cognitive dissonance is, frankly, this feeling of emotion, specifically of discomfort, that is caused by conflict associated with feelings of being a hypocrite. For instance, I say, I am a healthy person, but my friends see me smoking cigarettes. I don't like the way that feels inside me. Therefore, I come up with ways to reduce this feeling, this discomfort, this dissonance. My 3 options: 1, change my behavior. Just stop smoking. That'll do it, right? If you feel like a fake, if you feel like an imposter, if you feel like a hypocrite, just change your behavior. Well, how easy is that? I mean, if it were that easy, we would all change our behavior all the time. Don't like being a failure? Work harder. Don't like being unemployed? Work harder to find a job. Don't like making bad grades? Study more. But that's easier said than done. The second way you can go about reducing dissonance is to change your beliefs. Just say to yourself, it's not unhealthy. It's absolutely not unhealthy to smoke cigarettes. Yeah, actually, there's nothing wrong with smoking cigarettes. It's just a government conspiracy. It's just a clinical medical conspiracy to try to keep people from engaging in adult behavior. Now, at best, you're probably going to sound like a crazy person, a conspiracy theorist. So most people don't do this to reduce their dissonance. The thing most people do, most normal people that is, like yourself and others, is they do what is necessary to justify their behaviors. And most of the time, this means coming up with mental excuses or with intellectualizations or rationalizations, coming up with arguments that seem to smooth out the dissonance. Most of us do what is necessary to reduce this discomfort and maintain our self-esteem. Smoking is a great case example. You smoke cigarettes, but you consider yourself a smart and healthy person. How do you justify smoking cigarettes if you're smart and healthy? Well, you can say things like, I can quit anytime I want. You can say things like, well, I go to the gym. I eat healthy. You can say things like, I read. I go to class. I make good grades. You say things like, well, I'm having a particularly bad month, or I'm experiencing some turmoil in my life. I'll stop smoking once I get through the stress of my life. Or you say things like, well, at least I don't smoke crack. At least I don't smoke heroin. Or at least I don't buy the cigarettes. Or at least I only smoke when I drink. Leon Festinger, a man we mentioned earlier, coined the term cognitive dissonance. Leon Festinger, if you look him up in Google, lived an interesting life. He infiltrated a cult. He infiltrated a cult that believed the end of the world was near. And when it was time for the end of the world to occur, large numbers of cameramen and journalists and newspaper reporters camped outside of the location Festinger and the other cult members were located. And when the clock struck the hour that the end of the world was supposed to come, nothing happened. Festinger wondered to himself, what are these cult leaders and followers going to do now? What happened was amazing. The head of the cult turned to his subordinates and said, we did it. You did it. The media did it. We brought so much attention to our cause. We brought so much attention to the truth. Through all of these reporters, through all of these news journalists, through all these television cameras, that the end of the world didn't come. We stopped the end of the world from coming. Here's a laboratory experiment done by Festinger. He asked students to engage in a task. The task was pretty boring and trivial, to be honest. It was copying shapes or something similar to that. Very monotonous. Okay, very monotonous. Now, the real part of the experiment wasn't the copying of the shapes. The real part of the experiment was whether or not, after you finished copying the shapes, you received $1, $20, or were just told thank you for participating. Again, everybody in the study was asked to do this monotonous, kind of boring task. Everybody in the experiment was asked to do this. Everybody was also given either $1 for their participation, $20 for their participation, or just given a thank you. Immediately following this, all participants were asked 4 questions. How much fun was the task? How much did you learn? How scientifically important do you think the task was? And would you be willing to do the task again? And what did you find? What Festinger found was extraordinary. Was extraordinary. People that were paid $20 for doing it. And again, they didn't know they were going to get the $20. They were just given the $20 at random. Were no more likely than the people who were just told thank you to say they wanted to do it again. People that were given $20 were actually least likely to say it was scientifically important. they were just barely more likely to say they learned something than the control group who was just told thank you. And of course, they also suggested to the researchers, Festinger included, that they didn't really have any fun. I mean, in fact, the only group that said they had less fun was the control group that was told thank you. But notice the yellow bar graphs. In all 4 of these questions, people that received $1 at random were much more likely to say they were having fun, much more likely to say they had learned something, much more likely to say it was of scientific importance, and the only group to say they would do it again. What is going on here? It turns out that when you are experiencing cognitive dissonance, you can do something mentally or physically to overcome or to smooth out that dissonance. However, if I'm causing you that dissonance, I can do something to either make the dissonance worse or to smooth it out for you. By giving participants $1 after they participated in this boring task, Festinger was essentially giving these participants an excuse for having participated in this task. Although $1 is not really a good excuse, right? I mean, even in the 1960s, doing a boring task, a meaningless task, for $1 is not a good reason for doing it. Notice, however, those that received $20 at random for doing the same boring, monotonous task, now they really have a much better explanation. They have a much better reason for having done that task. Therefore, they can say to themselves and to others on a survey, no, it wasn't really that fun. I didn't learn that much. I don't think it was scientifically important. And no, I'm not going to do it again. But you did it. How can you say this? Well, because I got $20 for it. There are other weapons of influence besides conformity and obedience and cognitive dissonance. There's persuasion. One type of persuasive technique is what we call liking. What makes us like somebody? It turns out that giving someone a warm look or a smile or a thumbs up, whether it be in real life or in a virtual setting like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, is incredibly persuasive. So much so that one study took old yearbook photos, showed a random group of people these yearbook photos, and asked, which of these people do you think is the most attractive? The participants looked through the photographs and decided who was most attractive, who was least attractive. Then a post-analysis was done on the results. Researchers were surprised when they found that participants judging yearbook photos' attractiveness were more likely to find people smiling, genuinely smiling in these photos, more attractive than those who were not smiling. You be the judge. Attribution theory. Attributions are inferences we make about the causes of others' behavior, or about the causes of behavior, not just other people's behavior, maybe even our own behavior. Why do we judge others? How do we judge ourselves? Why is it so easy? And are we accurate are important questions. Well, a man named Hyder in the 1950s was one of the first to study attributions experimentally. And he came to the conclusion that there are two distinct types of attributions, two clear inferences that we can make. One is a dispositional inference, the other is situational. Dispositional inferences, Hyder said, are reasons that we believe are in a person's control. These are very personal reasons. So when I say that person was successful, that person is rich, because they worked very hard. They are very smart. They put in the effort. Very personal attributions. That's a dispositional attribution. Whereas if I were to say that person failed because they could not control their environment, they failed because others were keeping them back. They failed because they were fired from their job through no fault of their own. They failed because they didn't have a secure internet connection because they live in a rural area through no fault of their own. Then that would be a situational attribution because the reason would be outside that person's control. Now, what Hyder and others note is that in study after study, when we are asked to explain our own shortcomings, we tend to blame the environment. We tend to come up with all sorts of situational attributions or excuses. But when we're asked to evaluate, judge, or come up with attributions, reasons for why someone else fell short, someone else failed, particularly if that someone is a stranger, or if that someone has a different skin color, is of a different age category, is of a different social class, is someone we don't consider a peer, or worse yet, that we don't look up to, then we're more likely to come up with very personal, dispositional attributions. Attributions are about judging others, and they're about judging yourself. They're about judging others when others are successful and when others fail. They're about judging yourself when you're successful and when you fail. Self-serving bias is a very specific sort of attributional phenomenon. The self-serving bias predicts that we make more situational attributions for our failures and more dispositional ones for our successes. So not only are we more likely to use dispositional or personal attributions when we're explaining other people's failures versus when we're explaining our own failures, but we're also more likely to use dispositional attributions, personal attributions, when we're evaluating or explaining our own successes versus the successes of others. Right? So when it comes to explaining your own failure, you lean on external explanations, environmental ones, situational ones. When it comes to explaining the failures of others, you look towards personal attributions. But when it comes to explaining your own successes, you look towards personal attributions, dispositional ones. How did you make an A on exam 1? Because I'm smart, I'm focused, I'm mature, I come to class, I participate in class, I do all my homework, I email my instructor. I'm very serious, I'm forward thinking, I'm preparing, I've got a goal in mind. How'd you flunk exam 1? How did you do so badly on exam 1, you might be asked? Well, I had to work a double the night before, and I don't have a good internet connection. I can't access my book. You judgmental hypocrite. These are the last words on attribution theory. About 20 years after Hyder came up with attributional theory, specifically dispositional attributions and situational attributions, a man named Ross studied what he would call the fundamental attribution error. Ross noticed that when people are asked why someone else failed, you are more likely to say it's because Chris is too lazy. It's possible that the test was too difficult or that Chris didn't have access to the internet to access his book, but it's more likely you'll say Chris is too lazy because that's a personal attribution. That's a dispositional attribution. And it's common for us, all of us, to explain people's failures, not our own, but explain other people's failures with an over-reliance on personal or dispositional attributions. This is particularly likely to happen when you are judging or explaining people's behavior, particularly their failures, when they are in a minority. Again, when they don't fit your group, when they are not someone you look up to. This also may be culture-bound based on some recent research. Finally, the Kitty Genovese story. In 1964, a young 20-something-year-old Kitty Genovese was leaving her job as a bartender in New York City. She drove home, parked in the parking lot, and began walking across a relatively open parking lot towards her high-rise apartment building. When just before she made it to the front entrance of her high-rise, a man who had been stalking her grabbed her and began stabbing her. Kitty screamed and yelped and begged for mercy and for her life. Lights came on throughout the apartment building. Enough lights came on and enough people shouted to make the man or the perpetrator stop stabbing her and run away from the scene. But instead of going down to the parking lot, instead of leaving the lights on and continuing to ask who's down there, do you need help? The lights went back off in the building. The perpetrator came back. By this time, Kitty had crawled closer to her building, and the man began to stab her again. He would leave and come back a couple of times as lights came on and off in the building, and he would stab her ultimately about 30 times. She would die at the bottom of the stairs in her main apartment building, despite the fact that there were dozens of witnesses. No one did anything significant to stop the attack. It would be 20 or 30 minutes before the police/ambulance ever arrived. Like Stanley Milgram before, this was a real head scratcher. No one could explain how this could have happened. Some tried by saying, well, it's just proof that people are disconnected. It's proof that New Yorkers are cold and callous. In the same way, the Holocaust was explained, as if it was just something special and unique about this group of bystanders. The notion was that anywhere else in the United States, anywhere else in the world, maybe save Germany, this couldn't have happened. Somebody would have intervened. And as you're sitting there now, watching, listening to me, you're probably thinking, what would I have done? What would I do? If I were one of many witnesses, what would I have done? According to Latney and Darley's research in the 1960s, absolutely nothing. You would have done absolutely nothing. Darley and Latney's research, as you'll see here, demonstrates that, contrary to popular belief, not only will we not help others, we won't even help ourselves under certain conditions. What are those conditions? Take a look. People are less likely to help others if there are other people around who could possibly intervene. And counterintuitively, this goes against all common sense, if there's no one around who can help except you, you're more likely to help. Isn't this curious? So if you're ever in a situation where you might need help, where your life depends upon the intervention of another, you either hope that there's only one other standing by, or you do your best to make eye contact with, you do your best to pick out one person from that audience of bystanders. You make eye contact and you plead with that person. You make sure that person knows you're talking to them. Hey, you in the yellow shirt with the blue hat and the brown shoes, you call the police. You help me. That's all I have. You guys make sure you read through chapter 14, do your Learn Smarts, and next week we will start neuroscience. Have a great weekend. Good luck on that test.